Hello and welcome to this video on the transatlantic slave trade and its impact on Africa and the diaspora. The transatlantic slave trade, also known as the Middle Passage, was the forced migration of millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from the 16th to the 19th century. This dark chapter in human history had far-reaching consequences for both Africa and the diaspora, and it is important that we understand its impact in order to move forward and work towards healing and reconciliation. The transatlantic slave trade was a profitable business for European colonizers, who used enslaved Africans to work on their plantations and mines. The trade was brutal and inhumane, with millions of Africans being captured, sold, and transported across the ocean in brutal conditions. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a traumatic experience for enslaved Africans, who were often packed into ships like cargo and subjected to disease, starvation, and violence. The impact of the transatlantic slave trade on Africa was devastating. The trade led to the displacement of millions of people, the destruction of families and communities, and the loss of cultural heritage. European colonizers and traders would often raid African villages, capturing men, women, and children, and then sell them to European slave traders. This caused a lot of violence and destabilization in Africa, as well as political and economic instability. Many of the enslaved Africans captured were taken from the west coast of Africa, where the vast majority of the trade took place. The trade had a significant impact on the economies of African societies, as European colonizers took control of resources and land, leaving Africa impoverished and dependent on foreign powers. The slave trade also led to a significant loss of human capital in Africa, as the most able-bodied and educated people were taken as slaves. This made it difficult for Africa to develop and progress economically and socially. For those enslaved Africans who survived the journey across the Atlantic, their experiences in the Americas were no better. They were treated as property, subjected to brutal violence and exploitation, and denied their basic human rights. Enslaved Africans were forced to work long hours in harsh conditions, and were often punished severely for even the slightest infraction. They were also denied the right to marry, have families, or practice their own cultural and religious traditions. The legacy of slavery continues to impact the descendants of enslaved Africans, known as the diaspora, who have faced discrimination, oppression, and marginalization throughout history. The descendants of enslaved Africans have had to fight for their rights, including the right to education, voting, and equal opportunity, which were often denied to them. The diaspora also had to struggle to maintain their cultural heritage, as they were often forced to assimilate to the dominant culture of their new homes. The transatlantic slave trade also had an impact on the development of the Americas and the Caribbean. The economies of the United States, Brazil, and other countries in the Americas were built on the labor of enslaved Africans. The slave trade also led to the development of racial hierarchies and systems of oppression in the Americas, where people of African descent were considered inferior to those of European descent. This legacy of slavery and oppression continues to shape the societies of the Americas and the Caribbean today, with issues such as poverty, education, and healthcare disparities disproportionately affecting people of African descent. In addition to the physical, economic, and social impacts of the transatlantic slave trade, there is also the psychological trauma experienced by the enslaved Africans and their descendants. The trauma of being captured and sold, the Middle Passage, and the forced labor and violence experienced by enslaved Africans has been passed down through generations, causing intergenerational trauma that has affected the mental health and well-being of the descendants of enslaved Africans. This trauma can manifest in various ways, including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. It's also important to note that the transatlantic slave trade was not the only form of enslavement that occurred in Africa, it was also an internal trade. Many African societies had their own systems of enslavement and forced labor, which were also exploitative and inhumane. While these systems were not as large-scale as the transatlantic trade, they still had a profound impact on the lives of those affected by them. In conclusion, the transatlantic slave trade was a horrific and inhumane system that had a lasting impact on Africa and the diaspora. It is important that we remember and learn about this history so that we can work towards healing and reconciliation. We must also work to acknowledge and address the ongoing effects of slavery and the systemic racism that it has perpetuated. This includes addressing issues such as poverty, education, and healthcare disparities that disproportionately affect the descendants of enslaved Africans, and addressing the intergenerational trauma caused by the slave trade. Only through education and understanding can we hope to create a more just and equitable society for all. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more content like this.